Looks like everyone nearby has leadership -1. Battleshock tests are handed out indiscriminately, and when you fail them, the Chaos Knights might well get +1 to wound you. Let's talk Chaos Knights in 10th edition, who seem to have taken a leaf out of the Night Lord's book. They find it so much easier to kill you when you're half scared to death already. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today we're talking Chaos Knights. Games Workshop are continuing in their faction previews for 10th edition Warhammer 40k, and as always we've got some rather juicy details on the big spiky knights, plus a fair few new hints and wargear changes that all apply to their loyalist cousins as well. Getting into the reveals, and alongside all the specific rules that they unveiled, there are a fair few army trends that we can see. As we've been seeing with really quite a lot of these Warhammer 40k previews, Games Workshop do seem to be very pleased with their new Battleshock mechanic. It does look like it's going to be a major aspect to the new Warhammer 40k, and the Chaos Knights seem to be going down heavier on it than any faction that we've seen so far, both their faction and detachment rule really heavily revolving around it, and other things on their datasheets and stratagems giving them yet more benefits against things that get battle-shocked. For the datasheets, it looks like Abhorrents are toughness 12 and War Dogs are likely going to be toughness 10, the same as the Loyalists. It seems that there's a leadership 6+ as the standard for the Abhorrents, judging by the datasheets that we've seen, and it sounds like War Dogs will typically be leadership 7. For objective control, it's 10 on the Abhorrents and likely 8 on the War Dogs if we're going to be copying the Imperial Knights. The Titanic Knights still have the towering keyword, so you won't be able to hide them behind line of sight blocking terrain normally, plus have a keyword called Super Heavy Walker that we haven't seen yet, perhaps most likely to be another rule for stepping over intervening models maybe. And it seems that kind of similar to the last edition, the Abhorrent class Knights are going to get auras to buff their nearby War Dogs, potentially able to affect really quite a large swathe of them, but they're going to be less powerful than the Focus Bondsman abilities that it seems that the Imperial Knights are getting. They confirmed that in the preview it's still going to be a focus buff where you choose one knight, but this time both the Armiger and the Imperial Knight get a benefit, which is kind of fun. Aside from that though, the big rules reveals that we've had today are these. Harbingers of Dread is the primary army rule, basically a -1 leadership debuff for the whole game if you're nearby the knights, and then later in the game it transitions towards some offensive and defensive debuffs against battle-shocked units. The Traitoris Lance is their new launch detachment. This one allows you to force battle-shock tests on units within 12 inches that have taken any damage whatsoever. That's kind of nice for handing that out more. And then we've got some rules previews for the Warp Strike Claw and a Laser Destructor, one stratagem for War Dogs, and then datasheets for 2 of the Abhorrent classes, the Despoiler and the Abominant. Plenty to talk about as per normal, so let's get stuck in. First up, for their whole faction ability that you'll be able to get in every detachment, the Chaos Knights rule is called the Harbingers of Dread. This one's got a very similar style of stacking debuffs to the table that we had before, but rather than 10 different debuffs to choose from and multiple ways that you can go. Now, as with most things in 10th edition, it's kept super simple. One leadership debuff on battle round 1, and then an actual damage and defense debuff on battle round 3. I feel like it definitely keeps the same sort of flavour as the old table though. If you're nearby the Chaos Knights, then you get powerful leadership debuffs, and then later in the game the ability ramps up into more tangible benefits. The first ability that you get right from battle round 1 is called Despair. This is a 12-inch aura of -1 to your leadership tests, so really quite easy to hand out with your knights pushing forwards towards enemy lines. A -1 debuff to Battleshock is really quite a big deal, I think. Most armies in the game that we've seen so far either have a leadership of 6+ or 7+. With the -1, Marines will be failing on 6s or less for a 42% chance to fail Battleshock, almost half. I guess that'll make the Astartes know at least some fear. Or say for some armies like Guard or Leagues of Votan, they'd be failing on a 7 or less, or a 58% chance to fail. Very high indeed. It's fairly big in its own right, never mind that you can hand out Battleshock tests even easier with the detachment rules. It really does mean that the opponent will likely be failing a lot of these tests. Then from battle round 3 onwards, you also get Doom and Darkness. This one basically buffs your knight's damage against enemy units that are battle-shocked, and makes enemy battle-shocked units actually directly worse at dealing damage. The damage buff that the Chaos Knights get is a +1 to wound against battle-shocked enemies. That's both at range and in melee, so it's very general purpose there. It is quite nice to see Battleshock converted into something that's tangibly useful for damage dealing, and +1 wound is a really powerful buff. I think it's going to be most powerful for things with medium strength. I feel like the things like the rapid fire battle cannons, and the new and very scary profile for the 18-shot Gatling cannon, both of those do look pretty fearsome if you can get this buff on them. Anything that you were wounding on a 5+ or a 4+, that's going to give you a massive boost against them. The other part of the rule is a -1 to hit for battle-shocked units targeting your Chaos Knights. again at range and in melee. That'll be most powerful against things that don't hit on a particularly good number to start with. All the armies that typically hit on a 4+ really won't enjoy that, and again it applies to both range and melee. Overall, it certainly means that later in the game, keeping as much of the opponent's army battle shocked is going to give you a shoe into winning the damage game overall. These are a pretty excellent combo of rules, I think. I guess perhaps the biggest issue with this is that you're not getting them until battle round 3. It's perhaps a little bit awkward for the army of Chaos Knights in particular, seeing as a lot of their knights won't be able to hide. They don't really have quite as many options about playing KG compared with some other armies, but I guess it's still not impossible. Definitely seems like games should swing towards their favour towards the end of them. I guess the main job would be to score enough points and make sure enough of the knights stay alive to enjoy these benefits. Hand in hand with their faction rule, though, is their detachment rule, the Traitoris Lance. The faction rule wants you to be making as many enemy units battle shocked as possible, and this one will certainly give you some very powerful tools with which to do so. The way that this one works is that if your opponent has any models within 12 inches of your Chaos Knights, the units that stray into that radius must test battle shock in the opponent's command phase if they've either taken any casualties whatsoever, or if you had a starting strength of 1 if you've lost any wounds at all. Usually with battle shock it only applies if the enemy's squad is less than half strength. It's definitely not irrelevant, but not going to come up anywhere near as often as this, and this really is quite a big and reliable thing that you can do to hand out more battle shock tests. There's going to be a lot of value for just killing one model out of each enemy unit rather than wiping the entire thing. The small amount of effort that it takes to kill one model could well be worth it if you stop the rest of the unit from scoring objectives and using stratagems and things. It really does look pretty brutal in combination with the faction rule. I feel like it's going to be particularly nice with knights slamming home into the enemy lines, get a war dog or something in combat with an enemy shooting unit, hopefully kill at least one model or chip some damage off, have a very solid chance to make it battle shocked, and maybe lose casualties if you're trying to fall back via desperate escape. If any army is going to make battle shock relevant, it does seem to be these guys. Moving on though, and we've got a couple of weapon previews. Games Workshop does like showing off the big exciting guns and things, so we've got the Desecrator's Laser Destructor plus a Warp Strike Claw. The Desecrator Laser Destructor broadly seems at least fairly similar. It is a little bit more powerful, though maybe not by quite as much as it looks at first glance. You do get 3 shots on it rather than 2, and a ballistic skill of 2+ rather than 3. Its strength is increased to 18, but arguably that's a bit of a side grade. It'll still be wounding things that are tougher than Rhino on a 3+, so it hasn't really changed there too much, and it has actually taken a small damage nerf as well. Damage d6 plus 3 is worse than damage to d3 plus 6. Still though, it's going to be a gun that your opponent absolutely can't ignore if they've got some hard targets. On average, it gets 11 wounds per turn against a 3+ save vehicle without an invul save, though obviously that's massively swingy depending on how well you roll for damage and how many hits you convert. It does seem to have a very solid chance of one-shotting a light tank though. Invul saves definitely hurt it a fair bit though, it only averages 1 dead Terminator. It's going to be a fair bit more underwhelming into elite infantry. Otherwise, for big fancy weapon previews, we've got the Warp Strike Claw, this one being the Chaos equivalent of the Thunderstrike Gauntlet. Again, while these things have got big impressive stats that make people very impressed if they don't know the faction too well, this thing does seem to be broadly the same as it was before. 4 attacks hitting on a 3+, a strength 20, AP 3 and damage 8. As per previous, it's also got the option for a sweep mode as well, trading that out for a whole bunch of attacks hitting at damage 3. It looks like there's a Desecrator Knight pictured in that image. If that's really right, then it might imply that the Desecrator hits on a 3+ in close combat, but a 2+ at range now. I'm not 100% sure why they'd choose to swap that around if so. It does appear that the claw doesn't worsen your hit roll or anything like that. It seems to hit on the same values as the Reaper Chainsword as per the Despoiler datasheet that we'll get onto in a second. For average damage, as you'd expect, it kind of hits like a truck, 3 Intercessors, 2 Terminators, or around about 2 failed saves to a Rhino, or 1 failed save to a Land Raider. Again though, obviously very swingy, and could be a very good target for command point rerolls to reroll a failed wound roll. Next up, we've got a War Dog stratagem. This one seems to be going down the theme of War Dogs piling onto one enemy unit once more. There is a fairly similar one from the old codex, though this one is kind of interesting I think. The idea for this one is that you use it at the start of your shooting phase or your fight phase. You pick one enemy target and 2 or more War Dogs. Interesting that you could have as many as you wanted of these. From then on, all the War Dogs that you selected can only attack that target. They can't split fire or anything. But if you can deal with that, then you get quite a decent damage boost. Sustained hits 1 on all of your attacks, so that's extra hits on 6s. If you're hitting on 3s before, that's usually a 25% damage increase, not bad when it can affect multiple units. As with just about everything in Chaos Knights though, it seems to get better with Battleshock. Never mind the fact that from round 3 onwards you might be getting +1 to wound with that. If you also happen to be attacking a Battleshock's unit with this stratagem, then the critical hits go off on a 5+, so that means that the sustained hits would proxy on a 5 as well as a 6. That'll usually mean that each War Dog is effectively getting a +50% damage increase on what they'd normally have, really quite huge, and also theoretically even more crazily valuable if you use it on more than just 2 models. You could use it on a whole bunch if you wanted. As Games Workshop say in the article, it's maybe a bit of a trade-off as to how many War Dogs you think you want to try and pile into one target. Is it going to be overkill, or are you just going to be able to use all their damage output very efficiently? If you kill your target a bit too easily, you might have War Dogs standing around and not be able to shoot. Still though, definitely seems like a pretty powerful stratagem, particularly for armies that like to go heavy on War Dogs. This seems like a really nice way of, say, focusing fire with a whole bunch of War Dog executioners or similar. If the opponent's just got a really big hefty unit like an enemy super heavy or a big block of Terminators, you might not worry too much against piling a whole bunch of attacks into them. Finally, we've got a couple of datasheets as well. First up, we've got the Knight Despoiler, basically the Chaos Questoris pattern, the one with the generic options like the Chainsword and Gauntlet, plus the standard weapons like the Thermal Cannon and Gatling Cannon. Previously, we'd seen the stat line for Canis Rex. The stats of the Despoiler do seem to match that pretty well, to be honest. He does have a 3+ save with a 5+ invul against range, toughness 12 with 22 wounds, leadership 6 and an objective control of 10. I'd say maybe the most interesting thing about this preview though is all the stats for the different standard weapons that knights can bring. It's interesting that in an edition where really quite a lot of big guns do seem to have been having their stats toned down a little bit, these seem to be getting even stronger. Maybe it's partly due to having a little bit less knightly synergy with things like warlord traits and relics stacked up. I guess that might be a bit of a power hit for knights and chaos knights going forward. I think my favourite thing about the preview is just how dangerous the 3 standard weapons look. The battle cannon would already seem for the loyalists, d6 plus 3 shots and then rapid fire d6 plus 3, so essentially you're getting 2d6 plus 6 shots if you're within 36-inch range. Not exactly too hard to do. That's really a crazy amount of firepower when you strike it at strength 10 and damage 3. Otherwise though, the thermal cannon looks scary as well. It's called a Demon Breath thermal cannon here. It's basically a really big melter weapon with 2d3 shots. Its range has been decreased to 24 inches, and it strikes at strength 12, AP-4 and damage d6. I'd say the craziest thing about this weapon though is that if you do manage to get into close range, then the melter rule it has is melter 6. If you do get within 12 inches, then it means that each shot that punches enemy armor is going to be getting d6 plus 6 damage on the target, potentially up to 12 damage in one single strike. In reality, I guess that isn't really all that much of a threat range. You're not going to be striking that into enemy units at the back of their army, but it does feel pretty hilariously threatening if your opponent's got some vehicles moving forward. Finally, for the big guns, the new Gatling cannon profile is basically the same strength 6, AP-2 and damage 2 that it was before. Maybe just a little bit less general purpose now that some of the tougher vehicles are toughness 12 or more. It will be wounding some things on 6s now. Still though, that downside might not be the worst thing in the world, as now it's gone up from 12 shots all the way up to 18 shots. This thing is going to just absolutely mow down things like hordes and space marines. In one round of fire that should average around about 5 dead intercessors, an entire squad of space marines with a pretty reasonable chance to wipe them all. And I feel like it's a weapon that's going to be doing particularly well in the later rounds with that +1 to wound from the Dread abilities. If you can be wounding things like toughness 10 vehicles on a 4+ with this thing, it's going to deal a crazy amount of damage, particularly in a world where damage -1 seems to have gone away. Overall, really quite fun guns for the primary weapons for the Questoris, I think. Besides that, the melee weapons feel kind of similar in scope, still very threatening, being knight-sized combat weapons of course, and the Titanic feat still return as well as a different option that you can choose to strike with, 4 attacks at strength 8, AP-1 and damage 2. I guess that'll be particularly relevant for the Despoiler, as it can still have the option to double up on ranged guns if it wants to. If you really want, you could be taking 2 of those rapid fire battle cannons or 2 of those Gatling cannons for a crazy 36 shots. I guess that as with now, it's probably going to be pointed accordingly though. Otherwise, for the Carapace guns, the missile pods aren't too massively changed, but I did quite like the new version of the Icarus autocannons. For the Chaos Knights called Hellstorm autocannons apparently. These ones get 3 shots at strength 7, AP-1 and damage 2. They've got twin linked to reroll wound rolls, and interestingly they have an absolutely brutal rule for anti-fly. They wound fly targets on a 2+, so that sounds like anything with a keyword, not just aircraft now. Seems pretty solid, they do seem very good against those kind of targets, though both indirect firepower and big shot missiles are both hard to pass up. Finally, we've got some special rules for the Despoiler. He grants a +1 leadership to war dogs nearby, likely a 7+ to a 6+, judging by the Imperial Knight datasheet. Not nothing, but maybe not the most exciting aura in the world. And then for his own personal special rule, he gets a single reroll to either hit or wound, maybe nice on a thermal cannon perhaps, or one of his melee attacks. Handy enough, seeing as he does get some big hitting attacks, but if he were striking with something like a Gatling cannon, just re-rolling a single hit or wound on that isn't going to be the biggest deal in the world. Overall though, looks like a very solid knight. I'm pretty impressed with the sheer strength of the guns that they carry. They do feel like they've been buffed in a game where really quite a lot of other big guns have lost out a bit. Finally, last but by no means least, we have the Abominant. This is the fun psychic knight with a Terrorgeist on it. The stat line for the Abominant is broadly similar to the Despoiler, the same movement 10, toughness 12 and 22 wounds. The way it differs is in war gear and in psychic powers. For the war gear, I feel like it does follow the trend of having slightly amped up weaponry. The Volkite gun now gets 9 shots rather than 6, its strength is now 12, though it has lost a pip of AP, and it gets devastating wounds, so wound rolls of a 6 deal 3 mortal wounds, and the attack sequence ends. At least in theory, you should roughly average 1 wound roll of a 6 each time that you fire. This thing could be absolutely savage though. If you do look out and roll 2 or 3 6s in one round of attacks, you would certainly have some big threat against things that it usually shouldn't have too great effect against with 0 AP. In combat, the Bale Mace and the Electro Scourge look like they're going to be a bit more tailored towards fighting elite infantry in 10th, I'd say. Similar kinds of profiles, with strength 10, AP 2 and damage 3 on the Electro Scourge, with a big 9 attacks in combat, but maybe a little bit less general purpose, as you'll be wounding things like toughness 12 vehicles on a 5. Finally, in terms of special rules, it looks like the Psychic Knight gets 2 different psychic powers, one called Vortex Terrors and one called Warp Storms. Looks like these ones come with absolutely no risk of anything like perils in the warp to deal damage to the knight itself, they are just literally powers that will happen. Vortex Terrors is yet another way to hand out Battleshock. You use it at the start of your shooting phase, and one enemy unit within 12 inches must take a Battleshock test. That seems like it will be extra useful on round 3+. You get to fire this out to one unit that you really want to mark for death, and then everything in your army gets +1 to wound against it if it fails, due to the army special rule. I guess could be handy enough to try and stop the opponent using certain defensive stratagems as well. The other one is Warp Storms, and this one's a big area of effect psychic power. At the end of your movement phase, you roll 1d6 for each enemy unit within 9 inches of the model, and on a 3+, that enemy unit suffers d3 mortal wounds. I feel like there might be some battles where this winds up being quite big, particularly if your opponent has lots of small units that are rushing around the knight, and perhaps the Abominant manages to get somewhere into the centre of them. I feel like against a fair few armies though that might have just a few bigger solid units, you're only really going to be doing a bit of chip damage and then kind of unreliably. It feels like a nice to have, but maybe not enough to carry the knight just by itself. I suppose it could be handy enough for triggering Battleshock tests, given that the detachment rule will allow them to take them if they take any chip damage. So I guess perhaps the Abominant might be a really nice knight if you wanted to double down on Battleshock things. From the datasheet though, it does look like the knight's going to be significantly easier to kill. He doesn't have that 5+ feel no pain type power anymore. That one was one of his signature abilities before. Overall though, I'd say this looks like really quite a fun faction preview for the Chaos Knights. Some really big hitting weapons on their standard despoilers that those knights are able to double up on. Really quite cool interactions with the Battleshock mechanic, and lots of ways to make it meaningful besides just objectives, stratagems and fallback things. Plus I do think that War Dog stratagem looks potentially pretty interesting, being able to dogpile one enemy unit. Let me know your thoughts though. Does this preview make you excited for playing Spiky Knights on the tabletop? How would you rate the rules so far when compared with the 9th edition ones? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways, with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.